There are stories in America where success comes easy, where fortune smiles from the very beginning. This is not one of those stories. This is a story about a boy who wore shoes stuffed with cardboard because his family couldn't afford new ones. A story about a man who lost his two brothers in a single afternoon. A story about cancer, fire, and faith that refused to break. This is the story of Samuel Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, and the tragedies that built an empire. On March 14, 1921, in the small town of Eatonton, Georgia, a baby boy entered a world that was about to collapse. His parents named him Samuel Truett Cathy, after a famous preacher-evangelist named George W. Truett. He was the sixth of 7 children born to Joseph Benjamin Cathy and Leila James Kimball Cathy. The family had very little, but what they lacked in money, Truett's mother made up for in faith and determination. Joseph Cathy worked as an insurance salesman, knocking on doors and trying to convince families to protect their futures. But in 1929, when young Truett was just 8 years old, the world changed overnight. The stock market crashed, and the Great Depression swept across America like a wildfire, burning through savings, jobs, and hope. For Joseph Cathy, the Depression wasn't just an economic disaster. It was personal devastation. He watched his commissions vanish, his clients disappear, and his ability to provide for his family crumble. The man who sold security to others couldn't find any for himself. Years later, Truett would speak of his father with both love and sadness. "My father was caught in the Great Depression and never seemed to recover," he said. "So my mother became our leader." She was a hard-working woman with great spiritual depth. While Joseph struggled to find his footing in a world that had knocked him down, Leila Cathy became the backbone of the family. She found a house on Oak Street in Atlanta and turned it into a boarding house, renting rooms to strangers to keep food on the table. For the 7 Cathy children, life became a lesson in humility and patience. Truett remembered having boarders in the house from the time he was 4 years old. His mother was a wonderful cook, preparing meals that filled the house with warmth and the smell of home. But the rules were strict. The boarders were always served first at mealtime. The Cathy children had to wait their turn, eating whatever was left over. Sometimes there wasn't much, but they never complained. They understood, even as children, that survival required sacrifice. Truett's shoes became a symbol of that sacrifice. Other boys wore new leather shoes to school, polished and proper. Truett wore shoes with holes in the soles, stuffed with pieces of cardboard to keep his feet off the cold ground. He wasn't ashamed, but he also wasn't content. Something inside him, even at that young age, burned with the desire for something more. Not just for himself, but for his family. He wanted to help. He wanted to ease the burden his mother carried every single day. So at age 8, the same year the Depression hit, Truett set up a small stand in the front yard of their home. He bought chunks of ice from a man who came by on a horse-drawn carriage. He bought 6 packs of Coca-Cola for 25 cents and chilled the bottles with the ice. Then he stood outside, under the Georgia sun, and sold them for 5 cents each. 6 bottles sold meant a nickel profit for his family. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for a boy in cardboard shoes, something was better than nothing. By age 12, Truett had moved on to bigger dreams. He got a paper route with the Atlanta Journal, delivering newspapers through the neighborhoods of Atlanta. But he didn't just toss the papers onto lawns like other boys did. Truett treated every delivery with care. He said he delivered each paper as if he were delivering it to the front door of the governor's mansion. Rain or shine, early mornings or late afternoons, he showed up. He worked that route faithfully for 7 years, building something that money couldn't buy. A reputation. People knew Truett Cathy as a boy who kept his word. By age 14, Truett and his younger brother Ben had become the primary breadwinners of the Cathy family. 2 teenage boys carrying the weight of 7 children and 2 struggling parents. It made them grow up fast, but it also made them close. Truett and Ben weren't just brothers. They were partners. They were best friends. They dreamed together about the future, about one day opening a business of their own. Something small, something simple, something that belonged to them. Then the world called them to war. In 1939, at age 18, Truett was drafted into the United States Army. He served his country for 6 years during World War II, stationed far from Georgia, far from his family, far from the dreams he and Ben had whispered about late at night. But when the war ended in 1945, Truett came home with an honorable discharge and a fire in his heart. He was ready to build something, ready to bet everything on a single idea. It was time to make the dream real. Truett sold his car. Every penny he had, he pooled together with Ben. Together, they scraped together $4,000. Then, they walked into a local bank and asked for a loan. They needed $6,600 more. The banker looked at these 2 young men, one just back from the war, and took a chance. On May 23, 1946, Truett and Ben Cathy stood in front of a tiny piece of land near the Ford Assembly Plant in Hapeville, Georgia, just outside Atlanta. The building they constructed was barely big enough to turn around in, 512 square feet, 10 stools at a counter, 4 tables. That was it. They named it the Dwarf Grill. The name fit. It was small, humble, almost comically tiny compared to the big diners and restaurants of the time, but it was theirs. On opening day, they sold $58.20 worth of food. Burgers, steaks, coffee, sodas, the basics. Truett and Ben worked like machines, alternating 12-hour shifts to keep the place open 24 hours a day. One brother worked while the other slept. Then they switched. 6 days a week, over and over. It was exhausting, but it was working. The little restaurant near the Ford plant started to hum with life. Workers from the factory came in for breakfast before their shifts. Families stopped by for dinner. Late-night travelers grabbed coffee and a burger. The Dwarf Grill wasn't fancy, but it was clean. The food was good, and the Cathy brothers treated every customer like they mattered. Business grew. Slowly but surely, the dream was taking shape. Then came the day that shattered everything. It was a Saturday in July of 1949, just a normal summer day. Ben finished his shift at the Dwarf Grill, exhausted but satisfied. His older brother Horace, who had helped Truett build a modest farmhouse for his new bride, was waiting. Both Ben and Horace were licensed pilots. They loved flying. That afternoon, they decided to take a small plane up to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Maybe to visit friends. Maybe just to enjoy the freedom of the sky. The details don't matter. What matters is that they never arrived. Somewhere near Dalton, Georgia, the plane went down. Both brothers were killed instantly. In the space of a single afternoon, Truett Cathy lost 2 of his brothers, 2 men he loved, 2 men who had shaped his life in ways he couldn't measure. Ben, his business partner, his closest friend, the one who believed in the Dwarf Grill as much as he did, and Horace, the older brother who had swung a hammer beside him to build a home. Gone. Both of them. Just gone. Truett would later write about the moment he truly understood what had happened. "When I saw where Ben made out the report sheet on Saturday afternoon in good health," he said, "I realized again that he would never be back, and my tears flowed." That report sheet, filled out in Ben's handwriting just hours before the crash, became a ghost. A reminder that life can change in an instant. That no amount of planning, no amount of hard work can protect you from tragedy. The grief was overwhelming. Truett had every reason to walk away, to close the Dwarf Grill and find some other path, some easier road. The restaurant had been a partnership. How could he run it alone? How could he stand behind that counter every day, knowing Ben would never walk through the door again? But there was another reason he couldn't walk away. Ben's widow. Ben's daughter. They needed help. Truett felt a responsibility, not just to his brother's memory, but to the family Ben had left behind. And there was something else. Someone else. Her name was Jeanette McNeil. Truett had known her since they were both 8 years old. They met at the West End Baptist Church in Atlanta, a little boy and a little girl sitting in Sunday school, learning about faith and forgiveness. Truett later said he immediately had a crush on her that he never got over. But back then, they were just kids. It wasn't until years later, after Truett and Ben opened the Dwarf Grill, that romance began to bloom. There was a jukebox in the tiny restaurant, and Jeanette would come by. They'd talk. They'd laugh. They'd pick songs together, falling in love to the music of 1940s America. On September 19th, 1948, Truett married Jeanette McNeil. She wasn't like other young women of her time. Jeanette had attended the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, a rare achievement for a woman in the 1940s. She was educated, deeply spiritual, and she had a quiet strength that would become the foundation of everything Truett built. When Ben and Horace died, Jeanette didn't hesitate. She stepped into the Dwarf Grill, learning to wait tables, run the cash register, greet customers with a smile even as her husband grieved. Together, they carried on. Truett bought Ben's share of the business from his widow, making sure she and her daughter were provided for. Then he got back to work. Alone now, but not really. Jeanette was there. Faith was there. And the dream, though battered and bruised, was still alive. In 1951, Truett opened a second location in Forest Park. 2 Dwarf House restaurants now. If he wasn't having problems in one, he joked later, he was having problems in the other. But problems could be solved. Tragedy couldn't be undone, so he focused on what he could control: the food, the service, the business. And then, just as things seemed to be stabilizing, tragedy struck again. In 1960, the Forest Park location burned to the ground. Fire tore through the building, destroying everything. Equipment, furniture, dreams. Another setback, another loss. But by now, Truett had learned something about loss. It didn't have to be the end. It could be a beginning. Around the same time, Truett started experimenting with chicken. Up until then, the Dwarf House served typical diner food: burgers, steaks, fries. But a local poultry company, Good Brothers Poultry, approached him with an unusual offer. They supplied boneless, skinless chicken breasts to Delta Airlines for in-flight meals, but only certain sizes fit the airline trays. The rest, the scraps that were too big or too small, they had no use for. Could Truett use them? Truett thought back to his mother's kitchen, to the way she fried chicken in hot oil with a heavy lid to keep the steam pressure high. Tender, juicy, delicious. He bought a pressure cooker and started experimenting. frying boneless chicken breasts the way his mother had taught him, but faster, under pressure. By the early 1960s, he had something special, a boneless fried chicken sandwich, simple, clean, no greasy fingers, just pure flavor between two buns. He added pickles for a little tang, perfected the seasoning. In 1963, he trademarked the name, Chick-fil-A, a play on chicken fillet, with an A at the end to represent top quality. But before the chicken sandwich could make him famous, Truett faced another battle, this one inside his own body. At age 38, roughly around 1959, doctors gave him devastating news, colon cancer. He would need surgery. The prognosis was uncertain. Truett sat with Jeanette, trying to process what this meant. He had survived poverty. He had survived losing his brothers. He had survived fire and failure. But cancer? That was different. That was a fight he couldn't win with hard work or faith alone. Jeanette looked at her husband and spoke words that would carry him through the darkest moments ahead. "God isn't finished with your life yet," she said. "I don't think he's going to take you." Truett wasn't so sure, but he found peace in his faith. "Whether I lived or died," he said later, "I would be with God." He went into surgery with that peace, trusting that whatever happened was part of a plan bigger than himself. He survived. Not just the surgery, but the cancer itself. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years, and the cancer never came back. Truett Cathy would go on to live another 55 years, watching his children grow, his business expand, and his impact reach millions of people. That brush with death didn't make him fearful. It made him grateful. And it gave him a new mission: to use his life, every remaining day of it, to help others, especially children. In 1967, 21 years after opening the Dwarf Grill, Truett opened the first official Chick-fil-A restaurant. Not a diner, not a grill. A fast food restaurant dedicated entirely to that chicken sandwich he had perfected. The location was inside the Greenbrier Shopping Center in Atlanta, part of a brand new concept called a shopping mall. Most people thought restaurants didn't belong in malls, but Truett saw opportunity. Families shopping together would get hungry. Why not give them something fast, something delicious, something they could trust? The Chick-fil-A concept took off, but it wasn't just about the food. It was about the values. From the very beginning, Truett made a decision that shocked the business world. He would close every single Chick-fil-A restaurant on Sundays, every single one, no exceptions. Mall developers tried to change his mind. They offered money. They offered better lease terms. One even offered a $5,000 donation to a church of Truett's choice if he would just open on Sundays. Truett refused. He had been working 6 days a week since he was a teenager. He was tired. But more than that, he believed in honoring God and giving his employees time to rest, worship, and be with their families. Sunday was sacred, and no amount of money would change that. Critics said he was leaving billions of dollars on the table. Analysts said the policy would destroy the business. But Truett didn't care. "I see no conflict whatsoever between Christianity and good business practices," he said. "People say you can't mix business with religion. I say there's no other way." The Bible was his guidebook for life, and he ran his company accordingly. Integrity, honesty, service, compassion. These weren't just nice ideas. They were the rules, and the business grew. Chick-fil-A restaurants started appearing in shopping malls across the South, then the West, then nationwide. In 1986, Truett opened the first freestanding Chick-fil-A on North Druid Hills Road in Atlanta, no longer dependent on malls for foot traffic. The little chicken sandwich from a tiny Hapeville kitchen was becoming an American icon. But for Truett, success was never just about money. It was about people. In 1973, he started a scholarship program for Chick-fil-A employees. He had never gone to college himself. He understood the value of education and the barrier that cost created for young people with dreams. So he offered $1,000 scholarships to restaurant workers who wanted to pursue higher education. Over the decades, the company gave away more than $35 million in scholarships. Thousands of young people went to college because Truett Cathy believed in them. He also believed in children who had no one else. In 1984, Truett and Jeanette established the WinShape Foundation. The name came from their mission: to shape winners. Part of that foundation included WinShape Homes, a long-term foster care program. Instead of bouncing from home to home, foster children could live in stable, loving environments with house parents who cared about them. Truett and Jeanette personally fostered more than 150 children over 30 years. They didn't just write checks. They opened their home. They opened their hearts. "My riches are my family and my foster children," Truett once said. Not his billion-dollar company. Not his mansions or cars, his family, his children, the ones he raised and the ones he helped. Truett taught Sunday school at the First Baptist Church of Jonesboro, Georgia, for more than 50 years. Teenagers filled his classroom every week, listening to a man who had lived through poverty, tragedy, cancer, and success, sharing what he had learned. Hard work matters. Faith matters. Family matters. And 5% more effort can make the difference between success and failure. That last line became one of his most famous quotes. The difference between success and failure is often about 5% more effort. He lived it every day. By 2007, Forbes magazine ranked Truett Cathy as the 380th richest man in America and the 799th richest in the world. His net worth? $1.2 billion. The boy who wore shoes stuffed with cardboard had become a billionaire. But wealth didn't change who he was. He still showed up to work. He still walked into Chick-fil-A restaurants unannounced, carrying bags of little plush toy cows to hand out to children. He'd ask them, "What do the cows say?" And when they answered, "Eat more chicken," he'd grin and give them a toy. In 2012, Chick-fil-A surpassed KFC to become the #1 chicken restaurant chain in the United States, based on annual system-wide sales. The Little Dwarf Grill that started with $58.20 in sales in 1946 now generated $5 billion a year. And it was still closed on Sundays. Truett's 3 children, Dan, Don, and Trudy, all grew up working in the family business. They learned the values their parents lived: service, humility, faith. In August of 2001, Truett's eldest son, Dan, became president of Chick-fil-A. In November of 2013, Dan became CEO, and Truett stepped back to the role of chairman emeritus. He was 92 years old. He had built a company from nothing, survived tragedies that would have broken most men, and lived long enough to see his children and grandchildren carry the legacy forward. Then, in early 2006, something happened that Truett called the best day of my career. His grandson, Andrew Cathy, opened his own Chick-fil-A franchise in St. Petersburg, Florida. The 3rd generation had arrived. Truett stood at the grand opening, watching this young man who carried his blood and his name serve customers with the same care and pride that he and Ben had shown back in 1946. It came full circle. The dream didn't die with the brothers in that plane crash. It didn't die in the fire. It didn't die with cancer. It lived on. It grew. It thrived. On September 8, 2014, at 1:35 in the morning, Samuel Truett Cathy passed away at his home. He was 93 years old. The cause was complications from diabetes, not the cancer that had threatened him more than 50 years earlier. He died peacefully, surrounded by the people he loved. His wife of 65 years, Jeanette. His children, Dan, Don, and Trudy. His grandchildren. His great-grandchildren. The family he had built, both by blood and by choice. 2 days later, on September 10th, a public funeral was held at the First Baptist Church of Jonesboro, the same church where he had taught Sunday school for half a century. Thousands of people came to pay their respects: employees, franchisees, foster children he had helped raise, community leaders whose lives he had touched, pastors who had watched him live out his faith day after day, year after year. The tributes poured in from across the country. He was a man who demonstrated that faith and business could coexist, a man who chose people over profits, even when it cost him billions. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because less than a year later, on July 22, 2015, Jeanette McNeil Cathy passed away at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. She was 92 years old, the woman who had stood by Truett through poverty, through tragedy, through cancer, through the building of an empire, could not bear to be without him for long. She had been the spiritual nucleus of the family, the quiet strength behind every decision, the faith that held them together when everything seemed to be falling apart. She died surrounded by her loved ones, just as Truett had. And in death, as in life, they were together. Today, Chick-fil-A operates more than 3,000 restaurants across the United States and beyond. Every single one is still closed on Sundays. The company is still family-owned, led by Truett's grandson, Andrew, who became CEO in 2019. The WinShape Foundation continues to serve foster children through 13 homes in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Brazil. The scholarship program continues to send young people to college, and every day, millions of customers walk into Chick-fil-A restaurants and taste the legacy of a man who refused to let tragedy define him. Because that's the real story of Truett Cathy, not the $1 billion, not the restaurants, not even the famous chicken sandwich. The real story is about a boy in cardboard shoes who learned that hard work could change everything. A young man who lost his brothers but chose to honor their memory by carrying on. A husband who loved his wife for 65 years and built a life with her that mattered. A father who raised children to value character over cash. A cancer survivor who spent the rest of his life helping sick children feel less alone. A businessman who closed on Sundays because he believed rest and worship mattered more than money. The principles that guided Truett were simple, but they were lived with remarkable consistency. He believed that how you treat people when they can't do anything for you reveals your true character. So he treated the dishwasher with the same respect as the district manager. He believed that shortcuts might save time, but they cost credibility. So he never compromised on quality, even when it would have been easier and cheaper. He believed that success without significance is just accumulation. So he measured his life not by what he owned, but by how many lives he influenced. Those who worked closely with Truett tell stories that reveal the man behind the legend. Perry Ragsdale, the fourth employee hired at Chick-fil-A, and someone who worked alongside Truett for 44 years, remembered a moment during the economic crisis of the early 1980s. The company had expanded too quickly, opening dozens of new mall locations just as interest rates skyrocketed to 21%. Retail sales plummeted. Many of the hastily selected franchisees struggled. The company had also just built a $10 million headquarters. Standing in that new building, looking at empty parking lots and falling revenues, Truett turned to Perry and said quietly, "I think we're building a $10 million tombstone." The company survived that crisis, but the lesson stayed with Truett. Growth for growth's sake meant nothing. Sustainable success required patience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to core values. After that near disaster, Chick-fil-A slowed down, became more selective, focused on quality over quantity. The company that emerged was stronger, more resilient, and even more committed to the principles that had almost been compromised in the rush to expand. Truett's relationship with his employees went deeper than business. When a restaurant operator faced personal tragedy, Truett would show up. Not to check on the restaurant, but to check on the person. When an employee's child got seriously ill, Truett remembered. He called. He prayed. He helped however he could. When a longtime worker retired, Truett wrote personal thank you notes, recalling specific moments and contributions that showed he had been paying attention all along. There's a story about Henry White, a man who became the first employee Truett ever sent to college. At Truett's funeral in 2014, his son Bubba asked Henry, who was in his 70s by then, to stand up. The entire congregation erupted in applause, honoring not just Henry but the principle he represented. That everyone deserves opportunity. That potential matters more than pedigree. That investing in people always pays the highest returns. The Sunday school lessons Truett taught for over 50 years weren't just about Bible verses. They were about applying ancient wisdom to modern challenges. How do you run an ethical business in a world that rewards cutting corners? How do you raise children who value character in a culture that worships celebrity? How do you stay married for decades when half of marriages end in the courtroom? How do you handle success without becoming arrogant or wealth without becoming selfish? Truett answered these questions not with abstract theories, but with concrete examples from his own life. When he taught about forgiveness, he talked about forgiving the drunk driver who might have caused an accident, or the employee who made a costly mistake. When he taught about generosity, he talked about writing checks to WinShape even when the business was struggling. When he taught about faithfulness, he talked about Jeanette and how she stood by him when cancer came calling, when critics attacked, when loneliness from losing his brothers threatened to consume him. The teenagers in those classes grew up to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, pastors, business owners, and parents. Many of them stayed in touch with Truett throughout his life, writing letters to tell him how a lesson from decades earlier had helped them make a crucial decision. Others brought their own teenagers to meet him, wanting their children to shake hands with a man who embodied integrity. As Truett aged, his influence only grew. In 2008, President George W. Bush presented him with the President's Call to Service Award, recognizing his decades of volunteer work and philanthropy. In 2009, he received the Laurel-Crowned Circle Award from Omicron Delta Kappa, the National Leadership Honor Society's highest recognition. In 2013, he was inducted as a Georgia trustee, an honor given to individuals whose accomplishments reflect the ideals of Georgia's founding trustees from 1732. But the awards that meant the most to Truett were the handwritten thank you notes from foster children, the wedding invitations from former employees, the graduation announcements from scholarship recipients, and the simple words spoken by people whose lives he had touched. You believed in me when no one else did. You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. You showed me what a good man looks like. Near the end of his life, Truett reflected on the journey from Eatonton to Atlanta, from poverty to prosperity, from grief to grace. He acknowledged the pain, the setbacks, the moments when giving up seemed easier than going on. But he always came back to gratitude. Gratitude for parents who modeled faith even in hardship. Gratitude for brothers who taught him partnership and sacrifice. Gratitude for Jeanette, who loved him through everything. Gratitude for children and grandchildren who carried the legacy forward. Gratitude for employees who bought into the vision. Gratitude for customers who supported the mission. And above all, gratitude for a God who turned tragedy into triumph, again and again. The chicken sandwich that made Chick-fil-A famous remains essentially unchanged from the recipe Truett perfected in the early 1960s. A simple pressure-cooked chicken breast on a buttered bun with 2 pickles. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated. Just quality ingredients prepared with care and served with a smile. In many ways, that sandwich represents Truett's entire philosophy. Excellence doesn't require extravagance. Greatness often comes in simple packages, and the best things in life are usually the most basic done exceptionally well. Today, when you walk into any Chick-fil-A restaurant and hear an employee respond to your thank you with the signature "My pleasure," you're hearing an echo of Truett's belief that serving others is a privilege, not a burden. When you see teenagers working behind the counter with genuine smiles, you're seeing the result of a culture that values character and creates opportunity. When you notice how clean the restaurant is, how efficient the service, how friendly the atmosphere, you're experiencing the legacy of a man who believed that details matter because people matter. The closed-on-Sunday policy endures as perhaps the most visible symbol of Truett's conviction that some things transcend profit. In an industry built on convenience and constant availability, Chick-fil-A chooses one day of rest. Critics still argue it's leaving money on the table. Supporters see it as evidence that a company can be both successful and principled. Either way, the policy stands as a weekly reminder that Truett Cathy built something different, something that refuses to compromise core values even when doing so would be financially beneficial. And so the story continues, not just in restaurants and scholarships and foster homes, but in the hearts of people who learned from Truett's example that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story. That loss can lead to greater purpose, that the hard times shape character in ways prosperity never could, that faith tested by fire becomes unshakable, that love expressed through service outlasts everything else. Somewhere in Georgia, a teenager works a shift at Chick-fil-A, dreaming of college but unsure how to afford it. Next year, a scholarship will change everything. Somewhere else, a foster child celebrates a birthday in a win-shaped home, surrounded by stability and love for the first time in their young life. In a church classroom, volunteers teach Sunday school, carrying forward the tradition Truett maintained for half a century. And in boardrooms and kitchens and dining rooms across America, leaders try to build businesses and lives that honor the same principles Truett lived: integrity, service, faith, family, purpose beyond profit. The boy who wore shoes stuffed with cardboard grew up to help millions of others walk in better shoes. The young man who lost his brothers learned to be a brother to hundreds of foster children. The cancer survivor dedicated the rest of his life to healing others, not with medicine, but with opportunity, dignity, and hope. The businessman who closed on Sundays showed the world that rest and worship could coexist with remarkable success. And at the center of it all was love. Love for Jeanette that lasted 65 years and beyond. Love for children, both biological and chosen. Love for employees who became family. Love for customers who became friends. Love for a God who took a broken boy from the Depression and turned him into a blessing for millions. That love is Truett Cathy's truest legacy. More lasting than any restaurant. More valuable than any fortune. More powerful than any tragedy. It's the love that says, I see you. You matter. You have potential. Let me help you reach it. It's the love that builds rather than destroys, gives rather than takes, serves rather than demands. And it's the love that whispers to each of us, even now, that our own stories aren't over, that our own tragedies don't have to define us, that our own struggles can become sources of strength, that our own lives can matter in ways we never imagined. All we have to do is choose, as Truett chose again and again, to let difficulty make us better instead of bitter, to let loss teach us compassion instead of cynicism, and to let faith guide us toward purpose that outlasts our own brief time on earth. That is the story of Samuel Truett Cathy. That is why it matters, and that is why it will last. The story is about resilience, about faith tested by fire and refined into something unbreakable, about how loss can either destroy you or teach you what truly matters. Truett chose the second path. Every single time. When his father fell apart during the Depression, Truett learned to work. When his brothers died in that plane crash, Truett learned to lead. When cancer tried to take him, Truett learned to give. And when success finally came, he learned to share. He once said, I was born in poverty, and it was true. But he didn't die in poverty. He died surrounded by love, by legacy, by the knowledge that his life had meant something far bigger than himself. The years between the opening of that first Chick-fil-A in 1967 and Truett's death in 2014 were filled with moments both ordinary and extraordinary. There were grandchildren learning to make lemonade at the Dwarf House counter, just as their parents had done. There were foster children calling Truett and Jeanette grandma and grandpa, finding in them the stability they had never known. There were Sunday school lessons where a billionaire sat with teenagers and talked about faith, struggle, and what it means to live with integrity. Truett never lost his connection to the everyday details of his business. Even in his 80s and 90s, he would show up unannounced at Chick-fil-A restaurants across the country. Employees would look up to see the founder himself, often dressed casually, watching how they served customers, how they kept the restaurant clean, how they treated each other. He didn't come to criticize. He came to encourage, to thank them, to remind them that they weren't just selling chicken sandwiches. They were serving people, and people, Truett always believed, were what mattered most. He kept those bags of plush cows in the trunk of his car, a tradition that delighted children everywhere he went. Airport terminals, grocery stores, his own restaurants. Wherever there were kids, Truett would pull out a cow and ask his favorite question. What do the cows say? The children would giggle and shout, "Eat more chicken!" And Truett would hand over the toy with a smile that never got old, no matter how many times he repeated the ritual. It was simple. It was silly. But it was also pure joy. And after surviving so much pain in his life, Truett understood the value of joy. The WinShape Foundation grew beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple desire to help children in need became a comprehensive program touching thousands of lives. The WinShape homes provided long-term foster care in 13 locations across Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and even Brazil. Instead of institutional settings, children lived in family-style homes with house parents who made commitments to love them, guide them, and give them stability. Each home could house up to 12 children, often keeping sibling groups together when the traditional foster system would have separated them. Truett and Jeanette didn't just fund these homes. They visited them. They knew the children's names. They attended birthday parties and graduations. They prayed with families going through hard times. When a child in one of the Windshape homes got sick, Truett would call personally to check on them, remembering his own battle with cancer and how frightening illness could be. When a teenager in the program struggled in school, Jeanette would sit with them, patiently helping with homework, just as she had done with her own children decades earlier. The Windshape camps added another dimension to their mission. Every summer, thousands of young people from across the country and beyond would gather on the campus of Berry College in Georgia for camps designed to strengthen their Christian faith, build their character, and create memories that would last a lifetime. Swimming, hiking, horseback riding, crafts, music, and Bible study all blended together in an experience that many campers called life-changing. For some children, it was the only vacation they would ever take. For others, it was the place where they decided what kind of people they wanted to become. Truett and Jeanette would often walk through the camps together, hand in hand, watching children laugh and play. Jeanette, who had been a gifted singer and dancer in her youth, loved the music programs. Truett loved watching kids challenge themselves on the ropes courses and obstacle courses, seeing them discover courage they didn't know they had. These camps weren't about making money. In fact, they often ran at a loss. But to Truett, that was the point. Not everything worth doing makes financial sense. Some things you do simply because they're right. The scholarship program became another cornerstone of the Cathy legacy. Every year, thousands of Chick-fil-A restaurant employees would apply for the $1,000 scholarships. The criteria weren't based solely on grades. Truett wanted to reward character, work ethic, and potential. He remembered being a young man with dreams but no means to pursue them. He remembered what it felt like to want more but not know how to get there. So when a single mother working the drive-thru at night while raising 2 kids applied for a scholarship to study nursing, Truett made sure she got help. When a high school senior who worked weekends to help his family pay bills wanted to study engineering, the scholarship came through. Over the decades, more than $35 million went directly to young people pursuing education. But the impact couldn't be measured in dollars alone. Doctors, teachers, engineers, social workers, pastors, and business owners all traced their success back to a scholarship from a chicken restaurant. A scholarship from a man who believed that investing in people was the best investment anyone could make. Truett's Sunday school class at First Baptist Church Jonesboro became legendary. For over 50 years, teenagers filled that classroom, knowing they would hear more than religious platitudes. They would hear real stories from a real man who had really lived. Truett talked about losing his brothers and how grief nearly swallowed him whole. He talked about cancer and the terror of facing death at 38. He talked about business failures and the temptation to cut corners when money got tight. He talked about marriage and how Jeanette had saved him more times than he could count, not with grand gestures, but with quiet faithfulness. The teenagers asked hard questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? How do you keep believing when life keeps knocking you down? Is it really possible to be successful and still be a good person? Truett didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he shared what he knew. That faith doesn't mean life gets easier. It means you don't face it alone. that hard work matters, but so does rest. That money can buy comfort, but it can't buy peace. That the best legacy you can leave isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the people whose lives you touched. Some of those teenagers came back years later as adults, bringing their own children to meet the man who had helped shape who they became. They told stories about decisions they made because they remembered something Truett said. About marriages they saved because he taught them what commitment looked like. About jobs they turned down because the money was good, but the ethics were wrong, and Truett had showed them that character mattered more than cash. As Chick-fil-A expanded, Truett insisted on a business model that defied conventional wisdom. Most fast food franchises required franchisees to own multiple locations, treating restaurants like investments managed from a distance. Truett wanted the opposite. He wanted operators who worked in their restaurants, who knew their employees by name, who served customers directly. So Chick-fil-A franchisees typically owned just one location. They were required to be present, involved, and committed to excellence every single day. The selection process became incredibly competitive. Out of more than 20,000 applications in 2013, only 100 franchise licenses were awarded. That's a 0.5% acceptance rate, more selective than most Ivy League universities. Truett didn't just look at business plans and financial statements. He looked at character. He asked questions about faith, family, and values. He wanted to know how applicants treated people when no one important was watching. Because to Truett, everyone was important. The janitor mattered as much as the CEO. This philosophy created something rare in the fast food industry. A culture where employees stayed for years, even decades, where turnover was low and morale was high, where customers knew they'd be greeted with genuine smiles and treated with real respect. It wasn't just good business, it was good humanity. And it worked. Year after year, customer satisfaction surveys ranked Chick-fil-A at the top, ahead of chains that spent millions more on marketing and advertising. The closed-on-Sunday policy continued to generate debate. Economists calculated the billions of dollars in lost revenue. Business analysts questioned the wisdom of turning away customers 1/7 of every week. But Truett never wavered. He had made the decision back in 1946 when he was working himself to exhaustion at the Dwarf Grill. He needed rest. His employees needed rest. And more importantly, people needed something beyond work, beyond money, beyond the endless grind of earning and spending. They needed time for worship, for family, for simply being human. When shopping mall developers pushed back, threatening to exclude Chick-fil-A from their food courts, Truett held firm. When competitors used Sunday as their busiest day, trying to lure away Chick-fil-A customers, Truett stayed closed. When journalists asked if he ever regretted the policy, especially as the company grew massive, he would shake his head and smile. Regret? No. The best decision I ever made was closing on Sundays. It forced me to work smarter during the week. It gave my people a life outside of work. And it reminded everyone who worked for me that we serve a higher purpose than profit. That higher purpose showed up in countless small ways. When natural disasters struck communities, Chick-fil-A restaurants opened their kitchens to feed first responders and victims, giving away thousands of meals without charging a cent. When hospitals needed food for overnight staff during emergencies, local Chick-fil-A operators delivered, often cooking through the night to help. When schools faced budget cuts that eliminated art and music programs, WinShape Foundation grants kept those programs alive. These weren't publicity stunts. They were expressions of a worldview that said, "We are blessed so that we can bless others." Truett and Jeanette's marriage became a model that many admired. 65 years together. Through poverty and wealth, through tragedy and triumph, through sickness and health. They had disagreements, of course. Jeanette had strong opinions about business decisions, and she wasn't afraid to share them. Truett could be stubborn, convinced his way was right, even when it wasn't. But they always came back to respect, to love, to the promises they made in 1948 when they were young and hopeful, and had no idea what life would throw at them. Their story teaches us what truly matters. Not wealth, but character. Not success, but significance. Not what we gain, but what we give. Truett Cathy lived this truth every day, and his legacy continues to inspire millions.